Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupaka Damayam Didati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Bitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. All right, so I understand we are on Canto 3, Chapter 6, Text 8. Is that what you have up there? Yeah. Oh, I see. I see. So we could look through 3 as well. Okay. Well, I'll read it and then do the purport, and then we'll collectively, responsively do this verse 3, 6, 8. Savai Vishva Srijam Garbho Deva Karmatma Sanktiman Vibhabhajat Manatmanam Ekadha Sadatridha. The total energy of the Mahatat in the form of the gigantic Virat Roop divided himself by himself into the consciousness of the living entities, the life of activity, and self-identification, which are subdivided into 1, 10, and 3, respectively. So I'll read that again. It's a little hard to grasp. The total energy of the Mahatat in the form of the gigantic Virat Roop divided himself by himself into the consciousness of the living entities, the life of activity, and self-identification, which are subdivided into 1, 10, and 3, respectively. So the purport by Srila Prabhupada is as follows. Consciousness is the sign of the living entity or the soul. The existence of the soul is manifest in the form of consciousness called Gyan Shakti. The total consciousness is that of the gigantic Virat Roop, And the same consciousness is exhibited in individual persons. The activity of consciousness is performed through the air of life, which is of 10 divisions. The air of life is called prana, apana, udana, vyana, and samana, and are also differently qualified as naga, kurma, krikara, devadatta, and dhananjaya. The consciousness of the soul becomes polluted by the material atmosphere, and thus various activities are exhibited in the false ego of bodily identification. These various activities are described in Bhagavad Gita 2:41 as bahu shaka hiyanantascha buddhayo vyavisayanam. The conditioned soul is bewildered into various activities for want of pure consciousness. In pure consciousness, the activity is one. The consciousness of the individual soul becomes one with the supreme consciousness when there is complete synthesis between the two. Monists believe, the monist believes, that there is only one consciousness, whereas the sattvatas, or devotees, believe that although there is undoubtedly one consciousness, they are one because there is agreement. The individual consciousness is advised to dovetail with the Supreme Consciousness as instructed by the Lord in Bhagavad Gita 1866. Sarva dharman parityajya mam ekam sharanam vraja. The individual consciousness, Arjuna, is advised to dovetail with the Supreme Consciousness and thus maintain his conscious purity. It is foolish to try to stop the activities of consciousness, but they can be purified when they are dovetailed with the Supreme. This consciousness is divided into 3 modes of self-identification according to the proportion of purity. Adhyatmika, or self-identification with the body and the mind. Adibhautika, or self-identification with the material products. And Adidaivika, or self-identification as servant of the Lord. Of the 3, Adidaivika, self-identification, is the beginning of purity of consciousness in pursuance of the desire of the Lord. Okay, so now we'll do this one. Esha hyasesha sattvanam Esha hyasesha sattvanam Atmasha paramatmana Atmamsa paramatmana Adyo vataro yatrasau Adyo vataro yatrasau Bhutagramo vibhavyate Bhutagramo vibhavyate Esha hasesha sattvanam Atmangsa paramatmanaha Adyo vataro yatrasau Bhutagramo vibhavyate. Take it away. Esha hisesha sattvanam Atmangsaha paramatmanaha Adyo vataro yatrasau Bhutagramo vibhavyate Esha hyasesha sattvanam Atmangsa paramatmanaha Adyo vataro yatrasau Bhutagramo vibhavyate Esha hyasesha sattvanam Atmangsa Paramatmanaha Adyo Vataro Yatrasau Bhutagramo Vibhavyate. Ladies. Ersha Hyasersha Satvanam Atmangsa Paramatmanaha Adyo Vataro Yatrasau Bhutagramo Vibhavyate. This gigantic universal form of the Supreme Lord is the first incarnation and plenary portion of the Supersoul. He is the self of an unlimited number of living entities, and in him rests the aggregate creation which thus flourishes. So I say, and you please repeat, the gigantic universal form of the Supreme Lord is the first incarnation and plenary portion of the Supersoul. He is the self of an unlimited number of living entities, and in him rests the aggregate creation which thus flourishes. So here we have Prabhupada's purport, which is not very long. The Supreme Lord expands himself in two ways: by personal plenary expansions and separated minute expansions. The personal plenary expansions are Vishnu tattvas, and the separated expansions are living entities. Since the living entities are very small, they are sometimes described as the marginal energy of the Lord. But the mystic yogis consider the living entities and the Supersoul Paramatma to be one and the same. It is, however, a minor point of controversy. After all, everything created rests on the gigantic Virat, or universal form of the Lord. Esa hithersha satvanam atmangsa paramatmanaha adyo vataro yatrasau bhutagramo vibhavyate. The gigantic universal form of the Supreme Lord is the first incarnation and plenary portion of the Supersoul. He is the self of an unlimited number of living entities, and in him rests the aggregate creation which thus flourishes. Okay, so I'll start off with what's the easiest thing to start off with here. Is an explanation of this particular verse that we just read that I was supposed to give class on, which is 3:6-8. And what we're learning here is that the Virat Rup, also sometimes known as the Virat Purush, sometimes also known as the, the Vishvarup. So there are these different names, Vishvarup, Virat Rup, Virat Purush. And this is the universal form that Arjuna saw in 11th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So this form of the Lord is described in many ways, and we find that this is a material form, a huge form, and it is the form in which we dwell and walk around and all that kind of thing. So this is the Virat Rup or Virat Purush. Arjuna saw a particular version of it, and this form is, we learn today in this verse, this form generates or telescopes out from the Kshirodakshayi Vishnu expansion of the Supreme. So we have Mahavishnu, the great Vishnu. He's also known as Karna Navashayi Vishnu, the Vishnu that sleeps on the causal ocean, and from him all the universes come out. And into each universe, innumerable universes, he enters again as Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. So there's one Mahavishnu or Karnanavashaya Vishnu or Karnadakshaya Vishnu. There's one of them. But unlimited Garbha Vishnus come out and they enter into each universe. Now, in each universe, Garbha Vishnu lies down, and from his perspiration comes the Garbha ocean, and he lies on the Garbha ocean on his serpent bed, and from his navel grows the lotus flower from which Brahma will emerge. There's a third expansion. In each universe, Kshirodakshaya Vishnu expands, and he resides on the milk ocean that is in Svetadweep, which is in every material universe has its Svetadweep. And there he resides also on a serpent bed, but he resides in the Kshir or milk ocean. So there's three Vishnus, and they're known by what water they reside on: the causal waters, the Garbha waters, or the milk waters. So these are three. And evidently from the third one, Kshirodakshaya Vishnu, this is where the supersoul expands from. So the supersoul, which is in the heart of every living entity, is expanded from this Kshirodakshaya Vishnu. And this Virat Purush, or Virat Rup, expands from the supersoul. So we see it's like a domino or telescope. One thing telescopes out into another, telescopes out into another. And in this way, the entire creation kind of telescopes out from the Supreme Lord. So we have the spiritual world, which is always there. It never goes through cycles of creation and destruction. But we have the material world, which does go through cycles of creation and destruction. And we spoke about last week how the Supreme Lord's glance impregnates the living entities into the material energy. And because they have material desires and karma, the action of the material energy begins to move forward. So we have various kinds of activities happening in the material world based on the desires of the living entities as they engage their senses. So as we heard today, some consider that the Supreme Lord is one. And we also understand that everything is one. However, we don't stop there. We say that also the living entities are individual. So yes, they are one, and yes, they are different. And yes, that doesn't make exactly sense. And so that's why it's called Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. Achintya means inconceivable, Bheda means different, Abheda means not different. And the living entities are also called sometimes Bhinna, which means separated. So in 7.4 we have Bhina Prakritir Ashtada. So the material energies are separated energies, and the living entities are sometimes called Vibhinamsas. So we are Vibhinamsas, or separated living entities, like sparks. And as the other explanation goes, we are particles of the Tatastha Shakti. So there is the great Shakti on one side, the spiritual world, which is immeasurable and incomprehensible. And on the other side, there's the other great Shakti, which is the material world, which is also immeasurable and immense. And we are like a tiny thing in between those two huge energies. And that's why we flip and flop between one and the other. Sometimes we identify with the Supreme Lord and we act in a spiritual way, and sometimes we forget about the Supreme Lord and we act according to the direction of the material energy. So we are in between. And This Virat Rup is sometimes described by the fact that the Kshatriyas are the arms. The Brahmanas are sometimes called the head. I think in this chapter they're described as the mouth, but head, mouth, whatever you want. The Kshatriyas are the arms. The Vaishyas are the thighs or the belly, and the Shudras are the legs. So these are the various varnashram categories. And whether or not people accept it or not, whether they understand it or not, varnashram exists. And people will filter out or categorize out into these four categories of activity. Some are intellectuals, the brahmanas, and they teach and they guide society. And some are kshatriyas, and they administer society. They give orders, they maintain order, they do battle with chaotic forces from inside the community, and they deal with chaotic forces that seek to threaten the community from outside. So they do both things. Those are kshatriyas. The Vaishyas are actually the ones who give subsistence. They're the ones who arrange for the needs of the living entities, their food, their shelter, and so on. And so they are arranged into various communities depending on what kind of shelter they give, whether they give shelter in the sense of monetary. So there's a class of Vaishyas who are called Suvarna Vanik, and they are the ones who arrange for banking and commerce. Then there are Vaishyas who till the land and Vaishyas who own property, and so on and so forth. So these are various categories of Vaishyas. And finally we have the Sudras, which are non-categorized, sort of miscellaneous individuals who support the other three groups and perform activities that are necessary for the administration of society. They don't have any special skills, at least no major skills. So this is also a description of the Virat Rup. In chapter 10 of this canto, of the third canto, we will hear, is it chapter 10? Let me see. No, I think it's chapter 26. Let me see if I can reference it here. I believe it's in chapter 26, but I may be wrong. There is a description by Kapila Dev. We will run through this kind of same scenario a number of times in Bhagavatam, in second and third canto. We're hearing how the creation unfolds, and we're hearing some themes that get reiterated, one of which is this theme of the Virat Purush and the, Varnashram expansions that come from the Virat Purush. And in the verse yesterday, it was a little bit mysterious sounding, that there are life heirs. There's 10 of them. One is the consciousness, and the life heirs are 10. And there are these three kinds of activities, the Adi Bautik, Adi Atmik, and Adi Daivik. And these are evidently, this is the first time I've run across this, at least that I've remembered, that the Adi Bautik is to identify yourself with your Adi Atmik is to identify yourself with your body. Adi Bautik is to identify yourself with the, how did they put it, living in, with the elements. and the Adi Daivik is to identify with the Supreme. So these are three levels of consciousness. So we see how many levels there are. And this is the way the whole material universe works. There are categories and they expand out. And if we look at one of those categories, we'll see that category has categories, very fractal in the way the whole thing is designed. There's categories within categories within categories. And that's why, as far as the scientists go, the good news is that they'll never be out of a job. That it's whatever you want to study, you can always go deeper into it. And the bad news is that you'll never quite figure anything out. And what's actually going on, the core of what's going on, the scientists have no hope of figuring it out, because for the most part, they want to do it empirically, and you cannot do it empirically. As Prabhupada explains, that, was it Prabhupada or someone else that was giving this explanation, that if you wanted to know how a baker, what a baker is about, you can't do it by studying the dough and the bread that he produces. You can take the bread, I think it was Burijan that uses this analogy, that if you have, like the scientists do, you study the bread with a microscope, you can see the fibers, but you're not going to find out anything about the baker. From that, from that you have to actually use another source, So therefore, trying to understand this source of this universe by studying it in minute detail will not actually give us any final deep knowledge. Who would guess that the source of everything is the Supreme Lord? He's a little blue boy, and he consorts with cowherd girls. And he has a lot of fun. And then sometimes he plays with his friends, his boyfriends, and they make sounds like frogs, and they jump around. And this is the source of everything. And he has shark-shaped earrings and all these kind of things. You would never figure this out from studying the material energy. But the material energy is so dense and so complex and so layered upon layered upon layered that each generation of human beings looks at it and comes up with kind of an idea of what's going on, and it sort of works, and then 50 years later they kind of silently scrap it and move on to another one, and these paradigms are constantly there, this mosaic of the way people see our world from a scientific viewpoint. However, the Bhagavatam does not get scrapped in a new version every, 150 years or 50 years or whatever it is, The Bhagavatam goes on because we understand the basic things. We know that the material universe is very complex, and we're all right with kind of a basic understanding of how all the material energies work. We know that there are countless material energies, as Krishna describes in Bhagavad Gita. What need is there for all this detailed knowledge, as Krishna is explaining in the 10th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the opulence of the absolute, So what need is there, Arjuna, of all this detailed knowledge? With a single fragment of myself, I pervade and support these universes. So just a tiny fragment does the job. So one of the things we notice here that's very strong in this particular chapter, chapter 6 of the 3rd canto, is that we are learning about the Sankhya Elements. We keep hearing about them. This is another aspect of creation. Sankhya is sometimes described as having 23, sometimes 24. Sometimes they're a little bit different in one place and they are in another place. Not to worry. This is even described by Krishna himself later on in the 11th canto in his Uddhava Gita. I think he describes that some authorities describe it a little bit one way and others a little bit differently. But at any rate, roughly, the explanation of the 24 elements of Sankhya are 4 groups of 5. So we have the 5 gross elements, the 5 subtle elements, then we have the working senses, and we have the knowledge acquiring senses. So that's 20. 4 times 5 is 20. So you have these 4 categories of 5. Gross material elements, subtle material elements, working senses, knowledge acquiring senses. And this is how reality works in the material world. The soul is hooked up like a kid on a computer game. So we are hooked up into this, and we have the subtle sense objects and the gross materials elements, and then we're hearing them, seeing them, smelling them, tasting them through the 5 knowledge-acquiring senses, and we act back out on them with the working senses, the arms, the legs, the tongue, belly, and genitals. So we're acting out on them through the working senses. This is how material energy works. It is a virtual reality. Krishna creates it, and he does it by this gradual unfolding process. And so there are 9 creations altogether, and these are mentioned in the 10th chapter, I believe, of the 3rd canto, this very canto that we're in. And we hear that first there is what we call the Mahat Sarga, which is the generation of the Mahatattva. The Pradhan is inert, it's not doing anything, but it's agitated by the Supreme and it becomes the Mahatattva. So that's the first step. This is all stuff that the Supreme Lord does. Brahma isn't part of this one. So this is called the Prakrita Sarga, the creation by the Supreme Lord. So the first 6 of the 9 aspects of unfolding creation are done by the Lord. So the first step is the Mahat Sarga. Then from that we get what's called the Ahama Sarga. So we have the false ego develops. So from the Mahatat, the false ego develops. Now the false ego develops into 3 separate categories, which are known as goodness, passion, and ignorance. There's the 3 modes of nature. And then the false ego again merges with those individual modes of nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance. And the first one it merges with is called the mode of ignorance. So when the false ego merges with the mode of ignorance, that's called the Bhuta Sarga. And from the Bhuta Sarga, we have the expansion of the subtle elements and the gross elements. So that's where we get this thing where you have, as we described it the other day, first there is sound, and sound creates ether, and ether creates form, and form, it goes on down that way. So that's Bhuta Sarga. Then when false ego merges in the mode of passion, the senses are created, the 5 knowledge-acquiring senses and the 5 working senses. So those are created in the, sometimes called Ayendra Sarga, and sometimes it's called Taijasa Sarga. So at any rate, the mode of passion mixing with ahankara, or false ego, creates the 10 senses. It also creates the intelligence. And finally, when the false ego once again merges with the mode of goodness, which is called the Vaikarika Sarga, we have the creation of the demigods that are controllers of the various senses. And we have the mind. So the mind is created in that step. So here we have generation of all the various 24 elements of Sankhya philosophy. So in the first 6 stages of creation. Mahatsarga, creation of the material universe. Ahamasarga, which is the creation of the false ego. The Bhuta Sarga, which is creation of the material elements. The Ayendra Sarga, or Taijasa Sarga, which is creation of the working and knowledge acquiring senses. And finally, the Vaikarika Sarga, which is the creation of the demigods that are in charge of the senses and operating them. So then there's Vaikarika Sarga, which is done by Brahma, which is the other three stages, where creation of unmoving living entities, creation of lower living entities, and then creation of human beings. And then we go on past that, creation of other demigods and so on and so forth. So that's the 9 stages of creation as they're described in the 10th chapter of the 3rd canto. So we're hearing this, and we'll be hearing it over and over again in slightly different ways. And this just shows us how intricate the material nature is. And we discover, too, that there is a creation of ignorance, which is sometimes called the tamasa sarga. And we talked about that the other day, the 5 kinds of ignorance which bewilder the living entity, how we come into this material world and how we get bamboozled in all these different ways with, as we heard, with thinking that we are the body, thinking that death is the end of everything, having no knowledge of the soul, getting involved with the material elements, and finally, being, completely head over heels for material acquisition. So these are the various stages that things go through. And it's a little bit over the top. There's so many different parts of it. As I talk about this and as I read about it, it starts to fit into my mind a little bit easier as time goes on. But don't worry if you can't remember or understand it all. But basically, we just see that material nature unfolds. And in this part of the Bhagavatam, we're seeing how things are linked together. How there are demigods that control the senses. And we're finding that there are, the senses are generated at a certain stage. And finally, when they're all generated, then we're ready for an actual, it's like getting the blueprint set up for an automobile factory, resourcing where you're going to get the metals, where you're going to get the machining done, where you're going to get the plastics done, where you're going to get the rubber, all that. And finally, once all that's done, then you're ready to actually open the factory, hire the employees, and start cranking out cars, which is where Brahma comes into the picture. At that point, he starts to crank out the cars, And so he's involved in trying to find bodies for the living entities, various types of bodies. And so that's a whole other stage of creation. So we're at 15 till. That gives us some time. And I can try to answer some questions, or maybe you all have some realizations, and we'll see where we go from there. This is kind of a lot of stuff, but when we understand how material creation works, then we realize we're not talking about some kind of airy-fairy guesswork thing. That the material nature is serious and it's complex, just as the scientists think. We also understand it's very complex. But we don't take it for literal fact the way the scientists do. We understand that ultimately it's Krishna's energies. They dance as he likes them to dance. And in this way, it's a virtual reality. It's not exactly what it seems. It is real. And the things that we do in this world definitely have consequences. But the material world is not what it appears to be. It appears that everything's here forever. It appears that everything is here like a giant candy shop and we can just reach it out and grab whichever kind of candy we want. But somehow or other, it just doesn't turn out that way, you know. We get our hands slapped. We don't get the candy that we want. We get something else, you know. So that's the way it works. Questions? Do we have the pass around mic? Okay. Anyone's got questions or comments?
Thank you, Maharaj. Wonderful. I mean, as you said, it is definitely complex, but when we find it complex, but you also said last line, you don't get what you want, and because it's complex, so you ask for something and you get something else
Right.
because of the three modes.
Right.
How to make sure? I mean, I'm not on the pure devotional stage. How do I make sure that I get what I want?
Well, the surefire way is to ask the Supreme Lord. As we know, akama, savakama, oba, moksha kama, udara, diti, rena, bhakti, gena, yajeta, purusham, param. That whether one has no material desires, or whether one has all material desires, or whether one desires liberation, still one should tivrena worship the Supreme Lord with great enthusiasm for the perfection. Now, the nice thing about worshiping the Supreme Lord, even for material desires, is that the Supreme Lord knows best. If he knows that you really don't need it or it's going to get you into trouble, likely he'll withhold it, and that's for your benefit, you know. But otherwise, if what you want is a material thing and you're working your way through it, the Supreme Lord may allow you to get some measure of your material desire fulfilled. And then by doing that, one will not get further entangled. As Dhruva Maharaj stated, you know, that I was searching for broken glass, and you have given me the greatest gem. You know, so Dhruva wanted to have a kingdom bigger than his grandfather, you know, and but when the Supreme Lord actually appeared before him, and Dhruva could ask him for whatever he wanted, at that point, Dhruva no longer wanted his material desire. So that's there, you know. So that can also occur. What's that?
We should not ask anything. We should not ask anything.
Well, we always can ask, and we should ask, for things which are beneficial and increase our devotional sentiment and our devotional commitment. That kind of thing is not only not a problem, it's actually wanted, because then, you know, we are trying to ask for helping our Krishna to help us to increase in devotional purity and devotional focus, you know, so that there's nothing wrong with that. That's called prayer, you know, and that's actually a very helpful thing in devotional service. I think Arjunananda had a question over here.
Thank you, Maharaj, for the nice class. In one of Prabhupada's purports, Prabhupada writes how material energy as well as spiritual energy both belong to Krishna. So he can employ either one of them in his service, because for him everything is spiritual. For us,
Right.
we distinguish as material and spiritual. So with this regard, in Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna mentions that bhinna me prakriti ashtada, he says the material energy is my separated energy. Whereas when he talks about the superior spiritual energy, he doesn't call them separated.
No.
So why is that distinction there?
Right, right. That's a good question. The material energy is called as separated energy, but it's also called as divine energy as well. Daivi Hesha Gunamaye Mama Maya Dara. Yeah, so he is, it is separated and it isn't separated. This is, kind of what you always run into when you're talking about the Supreme. You have to say something and then you have to say exactly the opposite, and both are true. So you run into this over and over again. We're simultaneously one with and different from the Supreme Lord. He's simultaneously very near, but he's simultaneously very far away. He's simultaneously inside everything. He's simultaneously outside everything. So, in this case, the material energy is only the material energy for those in material consciousness. For those in divine consciousness, even the material energy is the spiritual energy. We can think of it, I usually think of it using the Halloween analogy, that in Halloween people dress up with wearing masks and outfits and so on and so forth. And you come to a Halloween ball and, somebody's dressed up as Dracula, somebody's dressed up as a robot, somebody's dressed up as some, rock star or something like that, and we know, that isn't really Donald Trump over there. We know that isn't really the rock star. We know that really isn't Dracula. We know it's my friend so-and-so. So, if you know the people at the Halloween masquerade ball, then you're not at all put off by the masquerade. You know exactly who you're dealing with. But if you don't, you kind of have to take it at face value, which is the way that people in material consciousness are. They take the material energy for what it appears to be, which is not what it actually is. It appears a certain way. And the material energy has one purpose, and that is to hide Krishna like a big blanket, And it does that very well. But when a person engages in devotional service, the material energy starts cranking back on its hiding potency. And you begin to see Krishna everywhere through the cracks, because we know that from the discussion ontologically speaking, what we're doing, that Krishna is the spiritual world, Krishna is the material world, he's in everything, he's in every atom, he's inside, outside, he's our bodies, he's what we're thinking, he's everywhere. But in material consciousness, we look out, we don't see Krishna anywhere. So just see how powerful the material energy is to your mostly everyday atheists. They don't see Krishna anywhere. It doesn't appear that there's any kind of God anywhere. So this is how well the external energy works. That's what it's supposed to do. For those who don't want to see Krishna, then Krishna creates an energy that helps them to not see him. And it stays that way until we get serious about wanting to see him. Then gradually the blinders come off, and gradually we begin to recognize in the Halloween, banquet or the Halloween masquerade ball, who is who, what's really going on. So it is and it isn't. Oh yeah, Kavya Chandra has a question. He's going to give us a realization.
And then Krishna says, Daiviye Shagunamaya Mama Maya Duratyaya. And how could you get out? Like some people have some process, you do this, step. Then you're never going to, it's impossible. But Maya Metam Turantite, if you surrender to Krishna, he just takes you out.
He just takes it away, right?
Yeah. Otherwise
it's not.
Thinking you'll find your way out, from such an entanglement. But many try to say like that. Even so-called devotees, that you have to do this process, come to this level, that level, So we're just very fortunate Lord Chaitanya just, removes the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. So
in the spiritual world, there's no such thing as all this, varnashrams and everything.
Right. So the material energy is endlessly mutable, as we hear, and it's also bewildering. So when people look at it, they get a misunderstanding of what it's all about, kind of like the way when we look up at clouds in the summertime and we see, oh, that one looks like an elephant, oh, that one looks like Uncle Jack, or that one looks like a pig, or this one looks like a baby or something like that, you know. But if you look at the cloud long enough, it starts to further spread out, and it no longer looks like Uncle Jack anymore, or a baby, or an elephant, or a pig, or anything like that. It starts to look like something else. This is the same way with the material energy, that if you try to investigate it, to get to understand it, you will always be eventually bamboozled by it. And that's why if you study the history of science and of philosophies, every 50, 100 years, there's a new scientific movement, a new philosophy, and this time we know we really have it. You know, we know that what we had before wasn't right. We know Aristotle didn't get most of it right, but he was good when he was alive. You know, we know that didn't work so well, but now we've got it. Now Einstein's got it down. Then the next thing will come along and throw that out, and in this way, we constantly chase the details around, like, you know, a dog chasing its tail. And we never find out what's really going on here. We just learn details about details. You know, how, you know, what temperature wood burns at. We learn it, you know, different kinds of rubber that can be synthesized. We learn about different kinds of cross-sections of wings, which one flies better and which one's more stable. We learn all these kind of things. We don't wonder why we're here and where we need to go and why we suffer, no matter who you are. The interesting effect of material energy is that we suffer. And no one has an answer for that until you come to Bhagavatam and the devotional service. Then we explain why you're suffering and what it takes to gradually get out of here. You don't want to suffer. Okay, you're in the wrong place, buddy. You need to get out of here. And that place you want to go is the spiritual world. How do you get there? It's called devotional service. And it's not an airy-fairy guesswork thing. It's got steps. It's done in a certain way. You need to take a spiritual master. You need to follow certain austerities. You need to work at it. But eventually, you'll become detached from the material world and want to go back home, back to Godhead. All right, so we're at 9 up, and so I should stop here. So I thank you all for your kind attention. All glories to Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees. Hare Krishna.
His Holiness Kavi His Holiness Chandrasekhar Maharaj ki.
Hare Krishna.
Maharaj's ki jai.
Yeah. I'm going to do my sync clap, so that's just so I can sync the video and the audio. Yeah.